Goirle, Netherlands, October 6, 1944. A German soldier died saving Dutch children during World War II. For 60 years, nobody in the village dared to say his name. Not because they had forgotten. Because he was the enemy. On November 4, 2008, a small bronze statue was unveiled in the front garden of a private home in the village of Goirle, in the southern Netherlands. The statue showed a young soldier in a Wehrmacht helmet. He was carrying two children, one under each arm. It took 64 years to build that statue. Not because no one had the money. Not because no one cared. But because the soldier was German. And for 64 years, in a country that had been occupied, starved, and broken by Germany, nobody wanted to be the person who said, "This man deserves to be remembered." His name was Karl-Heinz Rosch. He was 18 years old. And the two children he carried that day, Toos and Jantje Kilsdonk, were alive in the crowd when the statue was finally unveiled. They were in their 70s by then. They had never forgotten his face. And for 60 years, they had carried the weight of a debt they were not allowed to repay. This is his story. Karl-Heinz Rosch was born on October 3, 1926. In Meissen, Germany, a city known for one thing above all else: porcelain. Delicate, breakable things. Things that shattered if you held them too hard. Things that required care. He grew up knowing what it felt like to be handled carelessly. He was an unwanted child. His parents had been forced into marriage by his birth, and the marriage collapsed almost immediately. Both sought new lives. Both found them. And Karl-Heinz, small, quiet, born in the city of fragile things, was left with his grandparents. His grandfather was the one who stayed. The one who showed up. The one who sat across the table from Karl-Heinz every morning and treated him like something worth keeping. Karl-Heinz loved forests. He wanted to become a forest ranger, someone who walked among trees all day, who protected things that couldn't protect themselves. He was good with animals. He was the kind of boy who, when a bird hit a window and fell stunned to the ground, would pick it up and wait until it was ready to fly before letting it go. He never learned to be hard. Maybe because nobody had ever been hard with him in the right way, only in the wrong way. His parents had been hard with him by leaving. His grandfather had been gentle with him by staying. And somewhere in the gap between those two things, Karl-Heinz had decided, without ever putting it into words, which one he wanted to be. In 1944, he graduated from school. 2 weeks later, the Wehrmacht drafted him. He had 2 weeks of military training. Then he was sent to the Western Front. He was 17 years old. Nobody asked if he was ready. Nobody asked if he wanted to go. That was not how it worked. By the autumn of 1944, the war had been turning for over a year. The great German advances were history now, history written in rubble and graves and the hollow eyes of soldiers who had been marching for 4 years and had long since stopped believing in what they were marching toward. The Allied forces had broken through Normandy in June and were pushing steadily east across France and Belgium. The liberation of the Netherlands had begun. But liberation is not a clean thing. It is artillery fire and burning farms and roads jammed with retreating columns and advancing columns and the bodies of people caught between them. It is a village that wakes up one morning under one flag and goes to sleep that night under another, and somewhere in the hours between, buildings burned and people died, and the children who survived would carry the sound of it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Karl-Heinz Rosch arrived into this, at 17, with 2 weeks of training and a steel helmet that was slightly too large for his head, and no idea, none at all, what any of it meant. He was assigned as a gunner in a Fallschirmjäger artillery unit and billeted, along with 5 other soldiers, at the farm of the Kilsdonk family in Goirle, a small farming village in North Brabant, 40 kilometers from the Belgian border. The Kilsdonks were not given a choice about this. No one asked Dutch farm families if they wanted German soldiers in their barn. But Karl-Heinz Rosch was not what the Kilsdonk family expected. He was quiet in a way that felt like apology, as if he understood that his presence in their home was a wound, and the least he could do was keep it as small as possible. He was 17. He had a face that had not yet decided what it wanted to look like when it grew up. He ate what he was given without complaint. He didn't break things. He didn't shout. And he noticed the children. Toos was 5. Jantje was 4. They were small, loud, constantly underfoot in the way that children are in farmhouses, always appearing in doorways at the wrong moment, always needing something. The other soldiers ignored them. Soldiers ignored children in occupied territory. It was easier that way, cleaner, less complicated. Karl-Heinz did not ignore them. He learned their names the first day. When Toos dropped something, he picked it up. When Jantje woke at night frightened by the distant artillery, which was getting less distant by the week, Karl-Heinz would sometimes crouch to the boy's level in the doorway and speak to him quietly. Nobody recorded what he said. But Jantje would stop crying. Their mother watched this. She didn't know what to do with it, this gentleness from a boy in a Wehrmacht uniform. She had been taught to fear those uniforms. She had good reasons to fear them. 5 men from Goirle had been tied to stakes and shot by German soldiers 2 years earlier. The stakes were still in the History Museum. The memory was still in everyone's body, and yet this particular boy in this particular uniform kept warning her when inspections were coming, so she could hide the radio, the bicycles, the things that would be confiscated. He did this quietly, without making it a transaction, without asking for anything in return. He did it because it was the right thing to do. The risk he was taking helping the occupied population conceal property from the Wehrmacht could be classified as treason. The punishment was death. He helped them anyway. He was 17, far from home, living in someone else's house in a country his army had broken. And somehow, despite everything, the uniform, the helmet, the war that had swallowed him before he was old enough to understand what he was agreeing to, he was still the boy from Meissen who picked up stunned birds and waited. October 3, 1944. Karl-Heinz Rosch turned 18. The Kilsdonk family quietly acknowledged it. There was no party, the world had run out of parties, but his mother said the date aloud at breakfast. She looked at him across the table. She said happy birthday to the German soldier who had been keeping her children from crying at night. He thanked her. 3 days later, he was dead. October 6, 1944. Morning. The Allied advance had reached Goirle. It started with a distant rumble, the kind that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Then it got closer. Then it was everywhere, the air itself shaking, and there was no more distance between the war and the farm. British artillery opened fire on German positions in and around the village. Inside the farmhouse, everyone understood immediately. The soldiers grabbed weapons, shouted to each other, moved. The orders were clear: get out of the building, get to the guns, take cover. Every second in the open was a second closer to dying. Karl-Heinz ran with the others. They poured out of the farmhouse door into the yard, 6 German soldiers in a line, boots on the cobblestones, the sound of incoming shells growing louder with each second, instinct overriding thought, every nerve in every body screaming the same word: run. And they ran. All of them. Except Karl-Heinz stopped. Because Tus and Jantje were in the yard. They were playing near the well. 5 years old and 4 years old, crouching in the dirt the way children crouch when they're in the middle of something important, some small game that only made sense to them. They had heard the explosions. They could feel the ground shaking. But they were children, and children sometimes don't know when to stop, and nobody had come to get them yet, and so they were still there, right there in the middle of the open yard, in the middle of the bombardment, looking up at the German soldiers running past them with wide, confused eyes. One of the soldiers glanced at them, kept running. Another looked, kept running. Nobody stopped. The shells were getting closer. Fragments of stone and dirt were already kicking up at the edges of the yard. The farmhouse roof took a hit somewhere behind them, and there was a crash and a sound like the world caving in. Every instinct that Karl-Heinz had, every animal, biological, irreducible instinct for survival, was screaming at him to run, to keep running, to not stop, to get to cover, to not die here, not today, not in this yard. He stopped. He looked at Tus. He looked at Jantje. And then he bent down, grabbed both of them, one under his left arm, one under his right, the way you carry something you cannot afford to drop, and he ran. Not toward the guns. Not toward cover. Toward the farmhouse basement. He pulled the heavy door open with one hand while holding both children with the other. He took the stairs fast. He found their mother in the dark below, and he placed them, gently, despite everything, into her arms. Their mother looked at his face. He looked back. There was no time for words. There was no time for anything. He turned. He went back up the stairs. He pushed the basement door open and stepped back out into the yard. He ran across the open ground toward the other side of the courtyard. He made it halfway. The mortar shell landed behind him. It landed in the exact spot where Tus and Jantje had been crouching moments before. The exact spot where Karl-Heinz had been standing when he bent down to pick them up. The blast killed him instantly. He was 18 years old and 3 days. What remained of him was scattered across the yard. 4 months afterward, fragments of his uniform hung in the branches of a tree at the edge of the courtyard, caught there by the blast, too high to reach, turning slowly in the autumn wind like something that didn't know it was finished. The Kilsdonk family buried what they could find of him in the vegetable garden. Their mother did not speak for the rest of that day. She sat in the basement with Tus and Jantje on her lap, and she held them, and she did not say a single word about the boy who had put them there. What was there to say? He was the enemy. He was the reason her country was burning. He was the reason 5 men from her village had been tied to stakes and shot. He wore the uniform of everything she had spent 4 years learning to hate. And he had just died so her children could live. Some things are too large to speak. The war ended 8 months later. Germany surrendered. The occupation was over. The Dutch began the long, grinding work of rebuilding the houses, the roads, the food supply, the part of themselves that 4 years of occupation had tried to destroy. And Karl-Heinz Rosch's story went underground. Not forgotten, Toos and Jantje Kilsdonk carried it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Their mother never forgot the face of the boy who had handed her children back to her in the dark, the neighbor Leo Vermeer, who had been a young boy himself that October, quietly maintained Karl-Heinz's grave in the vegetable garden for years, until the reburial. In 1948, at the request of his grandfather, the old man from Meissen who had loved Karl-Heinz the way his parents could not, the remains were transferred to the German military cemetery at Isselstein. Section BF, Row 10, Plot 238. 31,000 German soldiers buried in one field in Limburg. Karl-Heinz's grandfather came to the Netherlands to see the grave. He stood there for a long time. And the people of Goirle, who knew the truth, who knew what had happened in that yard, who had watched a German boy pick up Dutch children and carry them to safety, said nothing to him. They let him leave without knowing. Because the grief of occupation is not simple. Because the 5 men tied to stakes were real. Because the hunger winter was real, and the deportations were real, and the systematic destruction of an entire country's dignity was real. Because in 1948, in 1958, in 1968, in a Netherlands still learning to live with what Germany had done to it, there was no language yet for a German soldier who was also a human being, who also saved children's lives. The categories did not allow for it. So the story stayed inside the Kilsdonk family. Inside the memory of those who had been there. Inside the vegetable garden where the grave had been. 60 years. In 2004, Toos Kilsdonk was in her 60s. She had lived her entire life carrying the weight of a debt she was not allowed to repay. She had grown up, raised children, grown old, and never once been able to say in public, "A German soldier saved my life when I was 5 years old, and I never got to thank him, and I need someone to know that he existed." She decided it was time. She gave her testimony. Her brother Jantje gave his. And a former city councillor named Herman van Ruwendaal listened to what they said and understood that 60 years of silence had been, perhaps, long enough. He began to raise funds for a memorial. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The city council voted against it. A statue of a Wehrmacht soldier, they said, was too socially sensitive. It might attract neo-Nazis. It was not appropriate to honor a German soldier when Dutch victims of German soldiers had no comparable memorial. Some Dutch are caught in a black and white way of thinking, Van Ruwendaal said. The Germans were all Nazis. The Dutch were all good. That there were also unsavory characters among us people who betrayed Jews, who collaborated, who profited from the occupation, one does not like to hear. He did not back down. We will not be honoring the Wehrmacht. We will be honoring the humanity of a young German soldier. There is a difference. And that difference matters. He raised private funds. He found a location, the front garden of Leo Vermeer, the man who had maintained Karl-Heinz's grave as a boy, who had never stopped keeping watch over it even after the reburial. On November 4, 2008, they gathered in that garden. It was a cold morning. The kind of November morning where your breath shows and the ground is hard and the light comes in flat and gray from the west. A small crowd had assembled: neighbors, former resistance members, journalists, historians. People who had argued for this moment and people who had argued against it, standing in the same garden because it had happened anyway. Jantje Kilsdonk was there. Jantje Kilsdonk was there. Two of Karl-Heinz Rosch's step-brothers, men who had grown up knowing almost nothing about how their brother died, were there. When the cloth was lifted from the statue, Jantje did not make a sound. She just looked at it. A young soldier in a Wehrmacht helmet, caught in bronze, one child under each arm, running toward a basement door that no longer existed. She looked at it for a long time. 64 years of silence, and then this, his face, preserved, exactly as she had last seen it, turned back toward her in the dark at the bottom of the stairs, the instant before he let go and went back up. She had been 5 years old. She was 70 now. And she finally got to say thank you. There is a question that will never have an answer. In the fraction of a second between seeing the children and choosing to stop, what did Karl-Heinz Rosch think? Did he think at all, or did the boy from Meissen, the boy who had grown up knowing what it felt like to be left, to be unwanted, to be someone the people with power chose not to protect, did he simply see two small people in a yard and do the only thing that felt possible? We don't know. We know only what he did. And we know that the shell landed in the exact spot where they had been standing. Which means that if Karl-Heinz Rosch had done what every other soldier did, what every survival instinct in every human body would have told him to do, what the war itself demanded of him, Jantje and Jantje Kilsdonk would have died in that yard on the morning of October 6, 1944. Instead they grew old. They had children. They had grandchildren. They stood in a garden on a cold November morning and watched a statue be unveiled of a boy in a helmet running with their 5-year-old and 4-year-old selves tucked under his arms, and they were alive to see it. Because of 1 second. Because of one decision. Because of a boy who had grown up learning that the world contains fragile things, and that some people run past them and some people stop. He never became a forest ranger. But he protected something that day. Something that grew.